Okay, there we go. So that's one reason. The other reason is that many commentators make the point that something about the opening of the Sefer Bamidbar Sinai or Bimidbar Sinai, talking about the desert, is an apropos topic to enter into Shavuos. That the desert is somehow conducive or appropriate for focusing on Kabbalah Torah, receiving the Torah. Of course, when we got the Torah, right, it was at Har Sinai, which is located in Midbar Sinai, in the Sinai desert. And so many draw a connection between the experience of receiving the Torah and the experience of being in the desert. And we're going to focus on one of those potential connections. So it's a very tangential connection to our parsha, just in that we're going to be focusing kind of on the desert, on the midbar, on that experience, and how that relates to Kabbalah Torah, to giving the Torah, and it'll give us a focus for both this Shabbos and the Yontif that immediately follows it. So we're going to begin with the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, source number 1. So this is commenting on Parshat Shmot, on Parshat Yitro, Sefer Shmot, where we come to the Sinai desert to receive the Torah. Vayachanu bamidbar, they encamped in the desert. Nitna Torah dimus parhesia b'makom hefker. The Torah was given openly in a public place. Shelo nitna Torah be'eretz Yisrael. She'ilu nitna Torah be'eretz Yisrael. Had Torah been given in the land of Israel, which we might have thought would be the most appropriate place for the Torah to be given, hayu omrim l'umot ha'olam ein lahem chelek ba. Then we might have come to the conclusion that the nations of the world have no portion in Torah. It's given in the land that is special for the Jewish people, then that might infer that the Torah is meant to exclude everyone else. Lefichach nitzna b'midbar dimos parhesia b'makom hefker. So therefore, the Torah was given in a very public manner, in a hefker place, in an ownerless place, so that anyone who wants to receive the Torah can come and receive it. So according to this, who is the intended audience of Kabbalah Torah?
Every person in the world.
Every person in the world. It's not just for the Jewish people. So we're going to kind of look at this theme for a little bit and then look at the counter theme and see what this might have to say to us. So the next source we're going to look at is really, we want to get to the Sifrei, but the Sifrei is kind of playing off the familiar Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which tells us, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Shloshak Tarimim. Rabbi Shimon says that there are 3 crowns. Now we got to do a little bit of simple counting, simple math. Keter Torah, Keter Kahuna, V'Keter Malchut. There's the crown of Torah, the crown of Kahuna, of priestdom, of priesthood. My camera's a little bit disoriented tonight, so I'm trying to figure out where to put my hands so you can see them. V'Keter Malchut, and the crown of kingdom, of kingship. The Keter Shem Tov Ole Al Gabei. The crown of a good name supersedes them all. What's the problem with this Mishnah?
Well, there are 4 crowns.
Yeah, he begins by saying there are 3 crowns, and then describes 4 of them. So is it 3 or is it 4? That's a good question for Pirkei Avot Shir, but we should identify that question. It is quite puzzling, but we really want to see the Sifrei for our purposes. So the Sifrei also begins. There are 3 crowns: Keter Torah, Keter Kahuna, Keter Malchut. The crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of kingship. Keter Kahuna Zacha Aaron V'Natlo. Aaron merited the crown of priesthood. Keter Malchut Zaka David V'Natlo. David merited the crown of kingship. Hare Keter Torah Munach. Kedei shelo yitain pitchon pele b'ayom lomar. Ilu haya Keter Malchut v'Keter Kahuna Munachim. Hariti zoche bahen v'notzlan. The Keter, the crown of Torah, was left ownerless, was left without anyone to claim it. so that there would not be any excuse for all the inhabitants of the world to say that had the crown of kingship and the crown of priesthood been left, we would have come and merited to take them. The crown of Torah is therefore left for anyone, all the inhabitants of the world. And anyone who merits the crown of Torah is considered as if they've really merited all three: the crown of Torah, the crown of kingship, and the crown of priesthood. And they can merit to get all of them. If you don't merit the crown of Torah, then you don't merit any of the other crowns either. Okay, so again, another source that seems to say very powerfully that Torah is intended or is open, right, to all the inhabitants of the world, even more strongly than in the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. Here it's saying that really they're punished, or held accountable in some way if they don't come and merit the crown of Torah. Any reactions to what we've seen so far?
Well,
okay. Yeah.
I've been
Go ahead.
learning about how precious each person's study of the Torah is. The chidush that each person has because of their uniqueness that they can bring in with the Torah also fits with this kind of idea that it's not a matter of comparing hierarchically who has more or less. The question is, what is my uniqueness and how can I bring it into the study of Torah, because for that I was created, that kind of approach.
Right, so that's a beautiful idea, and I very much identify with that idea. We could easily say that that is applicable only to those that are obligated to study Torah, right? It's not necessary, right? So if what you're saying is, well, it might be that non-Jews also have a unique Torah to offer and a unique chiddush, a unique new perspective on Torah to offer, which is quite an interesting and beautiful way to think about it.
No, actually, I was deriving that from the holy name Anochi, which, I mean, from the Rebbe, because the power to bring forth the Torah comes from those whom Hashem brought out of Egypt. So we have a special gift and responsibility to do this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the extent to which others feel that they have been brought out of some difficulty, perhaps one could make a case, but in general, they are not operating on a full battery, so to speak. So that makes our responsibility for teaching them and preparing them nonetheless that much greater. But I know you're heading into the contradiction. I'm trying to look for the passion.
Okay.
So,
okay.
That's okay,
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, so source number 4. Very provocative Gemara from Sanhedrin. Amar Reish Lakish. And someone will tell me when I need to scroll down in the English. Oved kochavim sheshavat chayav mita. An idolater who observes Shabbos, or a Gentile, right? Anytime in the Talmud that it says Oved kochavim, we're not sure what it's supposed to really say. Oftentimes it's said Nochri or Goy, and it would have to be edited when the Christians started bringing the Jews to task and to trial and then to persecution over derogatory statements made in the Talmud about non-Jews or about Christians. So oftentimes references were made, to idolaters, and the Christians didn't see themselves as idolaters, so therefore they thought it wasn't referring to them. So it's translated as a Gentile, although it says Oved Kochavim, an idolater. So a Gentile who observes Shabbos, chayav mita, is deserving of death. Shene'emar, as it says, v'yom v'layla lo yishbotu, right? That day and night shall not cease. It's read as lo yishbotu. They shall not observe Shabbos. Amar Mar, Azhar lahen zohi mitatan. And so we have a principle that when it comes to the Noachites, to non-Jews, generally in the halachic system, you need to have both a statement of a prohibition and then a second time where you're given an azhara, a warning against it with the penalty. But for non-Jews, it only needs to be referenced once. We don't need it to repeat it. Amar Ravina, afilu sheni b'Shabbat, afilu sheni b'Shabbos, right? Even if they observe their Sabbath on Monday or on Sunday, right? That even, if they have a day of Shabbos, even if it's not when Jews keep Shabbos, it would still be deserving of death. So then Gemara gets into an interesting side discussion. Why is this not included in one of the 7 Noachide commandments? That non-Jews are not allowed to keep Shabbos. So it says the count of 7 is only the negative mitzvot that they have, but it does not include the positive. So Shabbos, even though we associate Shabbos with restrictions, right? Shabbos is itself a positive commandment to keep Shabbos, so therefore that wouldn't be included. Well, they have one of the 7 Noachide commandments is to establish a court system. That seems to be a positive commandment. Kum ase vishev al tase ninu. No, setting up a court system really is a positive and a negative. We don't need to get into technicalities for that. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Oved kochavim she'osek b'Torah chayav mita. A non-Jew who studies Torah, who occupies himself with Torah, is deserving of death. Shene'amar Torah tzivalanu Moshe morasha. Right? Moshe commanded the Torah to us as a morasha. Lanu morasha velo lahem. It's a morasha, an inheritance for us and not for non-Jews. Same question. Lechashev gave shiva mitzvot. So why is the prohibition against studying Torah not included in the 7 Noachide commandments? Manda amar morasha migazel kagazil. So there's 2 ways that this word Torah Tzivalanu Moshe morasha kihilat Yaakov as a morasha. Some read it as morasha, an inheritance. So if you read it as inheritance, if a non-Jew were to come and study Torah, then it would be gizela, it would be stealing. So it is included in the Noachide commandments. Uman da amar me'orasa. Second way of understanding that word morasha is me'orasa, a bequeathment, a bequeathal, right? That the Torah is our marriage contract to God. So if we understand that word to mean some sort of marital relationship, dino kina'ara ha-me'orasa de beskila. Then it would be like all the rules against adultery and other prohibited sexual relations, which are also included in the 7 Noachide commandments. So again, it is included. Meitive. Okay, so at this point, if we were to stop the Gemara, right, we'd have a big question, a big problem with the 2 midrashim that we just saw, right? Because this Gemara seems to say pretty strongly that a non-Jew should not have any part in Torah. So but it gets a little bit more complicated when we continue. Meitive, Rabbi Meir Omer, minayin shafilu oved kochavim ve'osek b'Torah shehu kekohen gadol. Rabbi Meir says that how do we know that even a non-Jew who studies Torah is like a high priest? Shene'emar asher yaseh otam hadam b'chai banim. Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim lo ne'emar ela ha'adam. Alamadata shafilu oved kochavim ve'osek b'Torah harehu kekohen gadol. So he says that how do we know that if a non-Jew studies Torah, they're like a high priest? Because it says in Vayikra, these are the laws that a person shall do and live by them. It doesn't say these are the laws that a Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael should do. It says the laws that a person, a human, should do. So that teaches that even a non-Jew who studies Torah is like a high priest. So how does the Gemara resolve these two seeming contradictions? Hatam b'shiva mitzvot didahu. Right, when Rabbi Meir says that a non-Jew who studies Torah is like a Kohen Gadol, that's talking about the 7 Noachide commandments. If they study their mitzvot, then they're like a Kohen Gadol. If they study the other 606 mitzvot, then they're deserving of death. Okay, so which one is it? Is it like the Medrash, the Midrashim that we saw at the beginning, that say everyone has a part in Torah, and if they don't take their part in Torah, then they might be punished or held somehow responsible for that? Or is it like this Gemara that says a non-Jew who studies Torah is put to death?
Well, the question is really the commandment. What is the commandment?
Mm-hmm.
There is a commandment for non-Jews to study their the Noachide laws, and in fact, some of the Aseret Dibros are really derived from Noachide laws. So that is clear, and for us, we are to study the others. We are commanded to do it. So the answer is like the answer here. They are commanded to study their mitzvahs, which to some extent overlap with ours in certain ways. And in order to allow them to do so under those circumstances, one could perhaps point out those similarities. But I wanted to ask, why does this come down from Reish Lakish? He was a thief, wasn't he? And so on. I mean, but when exactly did he live? And what were the problems with people coming and saying they wanted to study the Torah and then turning against the Jewish people? Isn't this in the end of the first century, the beginning of the second century, when there were informers all over the place and so on? Is there any social context that could help us to understand why you would come to this position?
It's very possible. I hadn't thought about it in those terms. It's very possible that there is some, that was happening. Certainly, we know that in the times of the Talmud, they composed the bracha against Jewish apostates who then turned the Jews into the authorities, and that certainly Torah was used against the Jews. So it's possible that there was some historical social context that was sort of driving this statement. And certainly there was not an openness to, by and large, there was not an openness to engage in, classes in college about world religions or anthropology or things like that. But I never read it that way. I always read it kind of like generally Torah's, this position says Torah is not for non-Jews. But it could very well be that there is some historical or social impetus for that statement. That's an interesting way to think about it.
Is this prohibition of Gentiles keeping Shabbos the reason why when someone is converting, they have to at least perform one malacha during Shabbos? They have to break Shabbos in some way
partially.
Before the conversion?
It's a combination. Yes, that is one of the reasons why that is the case. The other reason is just, to impress that you're still in process and you're not yet Jewish. So don't think that by keeping Shabbos you can speed it along, or that you can that you don't need to see the process through to the end. So there's both of those reasons, but definitely it is part of that. Yeah. So I actually the page I just skipped over, sources 6 and 7 are dealing with the question of a non-Jew keeping Shabbos. If we have time, we can come back to it, but I wanted to focus more on the Torah aspect and the Shabbos aspect. So you can see some explanations for why non-Jews can't keep Shabbos, or some attempts at explaining it. But let's go to source number 9, which is another Gemara that seems to be along the same restrictive, exclusive line of thinking. Amar Rebbe, Ein Mosrin Sitrei Torah Elo Misha Yesh Bo Chamisha Dvarim. Rebbe says you can only give the secrets of Torah, generally understood to be some of the mystical, Kabbalistic aspects, to someone who has 5 characters, and we don't need to worry what they are, because it'll just confuse us more. But this is what we're really concerned about. Amar Rabbi Ami, Ein Mosrin Divrei Torah L'Goy. You cannot give words of Torah over to a non-Jew. Shene'emar, Lo asachein l'chol goy, mishpatim bal yida'u. It says in Tehillim that we say every morning as part of Sukkot de Zimra, he has not dealt so with any nation, and the Mishpatim Bal Yida'um, they have not known, or he has not made known to them the statutes, the laws. So there's another strong source that says we should not be teaching Torah to the non-Jews.
Yeah, and what do you call the?
Okay, source number 10. Source number 10 also is the continuation or a different variation of the statement that we saw in the Gemara Sanhedrin from Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir Omer, Minayin shafilu enochi v'osik b'torah shu kohen gadol. How do we know that even a non-Jew who studies Torah is like a high priest? Talmud Omar, Asher Yaseh Tam Adam B'chai Bahem, Kohanim Levim V'Yisraelim Lo Ne'amar Ela Adam. Halamada Tafilu Enochi v'osik b'torah Harei Hu kohen gadol. Right, the exact same thing we saw before, because the pasuk says that a person should do and live by them. It doesn't say that a kohen, a Levi, or Yisrael, but it says a person, any person who studies Torah is like a kohen gadol. Imrei ein mekablin alein schar k'mitzuve ve'oser elak misha eino mitzuve ve'oser. Amar Rabbi Chanina gadol ha'mitzuve ve'oser yoter misha eino mitzuve ve'oser. So they resolve the contradiction, right? The contradictory sources by saying, okay, a non-Jew can study Torah, but they only do so as someone who is not commanded in acts. We have a very interesting provocative statement that says it's greater to do something when you are commanded to do it than to do it when you're not commanded, when you're doing it voluntarily. Why might that be the case? I would think that if I'm not commanded to do something and I choose to do it nonetheless, that should be greater than if I'm doing it because I have to do it.
Well, we're
You're
commanded.
doing it out of obedience to Hashem. You're acknowledging
Okay.
his law, you're acknowledging his wishes, as opposed to just deciding something you want to do on your own.
Beautiful. So doing it out of an sense of commandedness is really a display of love and of submission to God's will. Anne, were you going to make another suggestion?
I was just going to add that sometimes when we feel, oh, we're commanded to do something, the Yetzer Hara says, oh, automatic no, that there's that within us, that it takes a little bit more to sometimes to bring ourselves to do it. So
Okay, good.
which is a natural phenomenon at various stages of one's life. So some swaths of years are more difficult.
Right, right. Others say that it might be, I think along the lines of what we were saying, but that if you're doing it because it's that something you want to do, then it's kind of selfish, right? That you're putting yourself first. And what happens if you're no longer inspired, right? You wake up one morning, I got to get to shul right on time. I'm going to sing the best tunes. I'm going to be really into it. And the next morning, you're too tired. You want to sleep in. You're no longer inspired, so it won't ensure long-term observance. Similarly, the Tosfot say that maybe it's because if you're not commanded, you won't be as particular about the details, right? Okay, Shabbos is a nice idea, so I'll have a nice meal, but then, maybe I won't be so careful about how I heat up the food for the day. So, but if you're commanded, then you have to pay attention to every single detail. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Tanu Rabbanan ukvar shalcha malchut romi shtei sardutiot etel chachmei Yisrael lamdunu toratchem. So it gives a story that the Roman empire sent two, how's it translated here? Military officials to the sages of Israel and said, teach us your Torah. Karu v'shanu v'shalshu v'shat v'tiratan amulahem yikdaknu b'chol toratchem ve'emetu. Right, so they studied Torah, they studied it 2 and 3 times, they became really well versed. And at the end of this endeavor, they say, we've learned your Torah, and it's all true, with the exception of one thing. Midavar zeh she'atem omrim, shor she'Yisrael shenagach, shor shel Knani patur. Shel Knani shenagach, shor she'Yisrael, bein tam bein muad, mishalim nezek. Mishalim nezek shalim. right? So there's a discrepancy in the laws of torts and damages that if a Jewish ox gores the ox of a non-Jew, the Jewish ox owner does not have to pay any damages. But if a non-Jewish ox, the ox of a non-Jew gores the ox of a Jew, then the non-Jew has to pay full damages. Mina nafshat, ireyehu dafka filu de Knani. Right? So they say it doesn't make sense, right? If we're going to say that it only that the laws of damages apply only to one's reya, to one's friend or colleague or equal, filu Knani, he nagaf Israeli pater. Then if a non-Jewish owned ox gores the ox of a Jew, they should be exempt. And if it doesn't have to be someone who's your friend or your equal, then if a Jew's ox gores a non-Jew's ox, they should be obligated. But we're not going to inform the king about this because everything else about Torah is true. So just be on the lookout, that there is this one troubling detail that they found, but because the rest of Torah is so valuable and redemptive, we're not going to inform or report back badly to you. Okay, so this seems to contradict your suggestion, because here, right, they could have easily used the Torah that they learned against the Jews, and they said we're not going to. They're not going to use it to get us in any trouble.
Right. And we've had a version of that as a stigma for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you interest? Oh, you don't, that whole problem. Yeah. So, yeah, that's why I was raising the question of motive, why a person would be studying Torah. I was trying to get at
Right.
person, a non-Jew. Certainly in Russia from about, 1875 or so, up and through to the present day, when they're still trying to make changes in education in order to make it more difficult for Jews. If somebody came up to somebody in the Lubavitch network and wanted to study Torah, it was supposed to be a secret network. Nobody's supposed to do it at all. It's entirely against the law. You'd really be suspicious of such a person.
Yeah.
It's so in a way it's a form of self-defense to put it this way, but there's more to it than that, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Okay, so the Tosfot addressed two interesting details about this Gemara that we just saw. The first is Harehu Kohen Gadol. Why is, in Rabbi Meir's opinion, why compare someone who learns Torah to a Kohen Gadol, to a high priest? Mm-hmm. It's a weird analogy. I mean, it's beautiful, but why specifically to Kohen Gadol, right? Why not to a great rabbi? Why not to Moshe Rabbeinu? Why to the Kohen Gadol? Hadanakad Kohen Gadol, Mishum Didarshinan Besota. Oh, sorry, let me scroll down. So what Tosfot asks, why is he compared to a Kohen Gadol, to a high priest? He says because in the Gemara in Sota, it quotes the verse Yikarahi Mipninim, Kohen Gadol Hikanes Likmai Velipnim. It says in the Gemara in Sota, quoting the pasuk from Mishlei, from Proverbs, Yikarahi Mipninim, that the Torah is more precious than jewels. And there the Gemara says, what does it mean the Torah is more precious than jewels? It's more precious than the Kohen Gadol Hanichnas Likmai Velipnim. It's more precious than the high priest who enters into the Holy of Holies. So therefore, the analogy of studying Torah to being like a high priest is because it's showing that you get even closer to God than the Kohen Gadol who entered into the Holy of Holies. The Tosfot continues, and I don't think this part was translated. That's my mistake. Im tomar v'ha amrinan b'chagiga hamilami Torah lo v'kochavim over ba'aseh dimagi dvav Yaakov. And if you ask the question that we've asked, it says in the Gemara in Chagiga and elsewhere that if you teach Torah to non-Jew, you have transgressed the positive commandment of Magi Dvav Yaakov, that God only tells his words to Yaakov, to the Jewish people. Kukav Mishtav Yisrael, Lo Asachein L'Chol Goy Mishpatim Bal Yeda'um. That's the That's the beginning of the pasuk we quoted previously. Yesh lomar debal karcho asu al pi divrei Moshe. So he gives two answers. Number one is that they were forced. The Jews were forced into this. What they weren't given the option, teach us the Torah or don't teach us the Torah. They were said, teach us the Torah. These were by representatives of the emperor, so they didn't have a choice. So veloni tchayvu limsor atzman, and they were not obligated to refuse. Right? There's only 3 cardinal sins that you have to give your life instead of violating. This is not one of them. So you're not allowed to teach a non-Jew Torah according to this, but if a non-Jew forces you to teach them Torah, you don't have to refrain. Inami asu atzmam gerim, or perhaps these Roman officials dressed up and made themselves to be converts. So that right in here, if that's the case, so they were using Torah against them, but ultimately Torah won out, and they didn't go through with their initial plan of using Torah, their newfound knowledge of Torah to do something evil or bad to the Jews. So Tosfot gives 2 answers to how the rabbis were able to teach Torah to these non-Jewish soldiers or whatever they were, officials in the government. Another explanation comes from the Meiri. So he talks about both the prohibition against a non-Jew observing Shabbos and the prohibition against teaching them Torah. Ben Noach shara'inu mitchased v'kovel atzmo yemei menucha Shabbos or Yom Tov ra'ui le'anish. So if a non-Jew becomes pious and religious and he wants to make for themselves a day of rest or a holiday, they should be punished. Afal pisha eno neharag, even though we can't kill them, right? It's not in our power. The Gemara says chayav mita. We don't have the power to subject non-Jews to capital punishments, but they should be punished nonetheless. Lo sof davar b'shekovei et atzmo al shalanu v'hu haromiz kan begoy sheshavat she'onshino tov amino lo o sheyikabel alav o malchut o mitzvot o lo yichadesh b'nimusav mishalanu. Okay, so that's the case of a non-Jew who keeps Shabbos, that we have to punish him, and we say to him, either accept the mitzvot, convert, or don't make up newfound practices based on our tradition. Af b'shekavala atzmo yamim achirim, k'mo she'amru kan af b'sheni b'Shabbos. Even if they establish their day not on Saturday but on a different day of the week, if they're making it as a Shabbos in the same way that we have a Shabbos, it would be problematic. She'im anichino to lechadesh bo v'likvoa yom chag la'atzmo lishbot bo mitorat chag. We do not allow a non-Jew to establish for themselves a holiday in the way that we have holidays. Shazeh nira kamisha hu mivnei aminu v'yolamdu acherim himenu. What's the reason Meiri says? It's because he gives the impression that he is of our people. He or she. This is not only for men, this is for women also, but they're given the impression that they're Jews. And therefore others may learn from their erroneous ways. So that's why the Meiri is concerned and explains this whole prohibition. V'chein hadin im asak b'Torah shelo lekavanat kiyum ikarei mitzvoteha ela shalibo chafetz lirid yidiat Toratenu v'Talmudenu. So similarly, if a non-Jew studies Torah, not for the purpose of fulfilling the mitzvot, but rather because his heart desires to understand and to know our Torah and our Talmud, he also should be punished because people will think that he is Jewish. Mitoch shero'in oto yodea, because they'll see that he knows Torah. V'yavo litzot acharav, and they may mistakenly follow after him. Mikol makom, kol shehu osek be'ikarei sheva mitzvot u'bifartehem u'v'ma sheyotze mehem af al pi sherov gufa Torah nichlalim bahem mechavdin oto afilu k'kohen gadol. But nonetheless, even though a non-Jew is not allowed to study Torah, if he involves himself in studying of the 7 Noachide commandments, right, which, according to one opinion, the majority, right, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, the majority of Torah is encapsulated one way or another in the 7 Noahide commandments. So you really could get a lot of Torah knowledge by just focusing on the 7 Noahide commandments. If that's what they do, then mechabdin otzo afilu k'kohen gadol, then we honor him even to the extent of a kohen gadol. She'ein kan chashash litzot acharav, because there is no concern that people will follow after him. Sharei af b'shalohu osik, because he's studying what's pertinent to him. So we could, you see someone dedicated to studying the laws that are relevant to their life. So that's something that we can and should emulate. The kol shekein im chakiratan al da'at lavo ad tachlit shleimut toratenu ad she'imuseenu shlema yachazor v'yitkayer. And all the more so if he's studying Torah as kind of a trial run to see if this is something of interest to him. That, it might be the beginning of a path to conversion. Interestingly, the Meiri is not saying turn him away, but if someone begins an honest quest, then we can facilitate their study of Torah if there's a possibility it will lead to conversion, and to complete acceptance of the Torah. Right? That he'll come maybe to fulfill all the mitzvot for the proper sake. Then you can study even the Torah that is not part of the 7 Noahide commandments. Okay, so for the Meiri, what's the concern about teaching Torah to a non-Jew or a non-Jew studying Torah?
People might think he's Jewish.
People might think he's Jewish, and if they think he's Jewish, they might
want to follow in his footsteps.
They might follow in his footsteps, and that would lead to improper Torah observance.
When did Meiri live?
The Meiri was a Rishon. He lived in the 1300s, but we've said this before. The Meiri, quite interesting, his works were lost for centuries. Everyone knew the Meiri existed. Everyone knew about him, but most of his writings were lost, and they were only rediscovered in the Cairo Geniza. And so there's interesting discussion about when the Meiri has some very important radical opinions, right? Most notably, he is one of the earliest sources that says Christianity should not be considered avodah zarah, should not be considered idolatrous. So the question is, what is the status of a halachic ruling of the Meiri? Do we treat him like a Rishon, one of the main authoritative sages that lived prior to the Shulchan Aruch, whose opinions carry major weight in halachic analysis? Or since he wasn't part of halachic debate and halachic discourse for centuries, maybe he should not be. And so there's different sages that have different opinions on that matter. He's a fascinating character, and for that reason. Okay, so he says there's really nothing inherently wrong with a non-Jew studying Torah, but that unless it leads to the mistake, to people mistakenly following after a Jew, right? So presumably, in our day and age, what would the Meiri say about a non-Jew taking Jewish studies classes in a university? Right, so that presumably no one's taking those classes. I mean, depending on the university, depending on the professor, but in general, people aren't taking university classes to learn how to follow Judaism. So might not be a problem, right?
We get messages from Christians trying to get Jews. And they have certain Jews that vow Christianity.
Yeah.
And they vow that they're Jews and all that.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. We know that.
Yeah. So there certainly is what to be aware of and cautious of. But the question is fundamentally, and I think that Rabbi Held's kind of source number 13 kind of just sums up this tension quite nicely. These two strains in rabbinic theology cannot diverge more starkly. According to one, non-Jews are condemned for studying Torah. According to the other, they are condemned for not studying it. Underlying this profound disagreement, I think, are two competing religious impulses. For Jews, the Torah is an immersive treasure, a unique window into the love and will of the Creator of heaven and earth. Having discovered such incomparable riches, what are we to do? One approach wants to spread the word and share our riches with the whole world. The other sees the treasure as inherently private, a matter of marital intimacy between God and God's people. To share it is to undermine and dilute it.
Mhm.
And so I thought that this was a really nice way to hopefully get ourselves into the mindset of Shavuos, not just in cooking and preparing and freaking out for a 3-day yontif and what's it going to be and what are we going to eat. So we always find what to eat miraculously. Right, but of course that's important considerations also. But it's just to think about what is Torah and how do we relate to Torah, right? And what's our worldview? Is our worldview we have this amazing gift, let's keep it for ourselves and not let others in, or is it something we want to share? It's more complicated, right? Because he points out later in this essay that even if you think the more universalistic approach that says we should be sharing this beautiful treasure with the whole world, well, that idea could lead to religious fanaticism and to trying to impose your will, right? Not like Jews do, but as Christians and other religions do, to try to missionize and try, to only accept your one religion as the only option and to have total intolerance for anyone else, right? You can share Torah with them, but it could lead to that kind of exclusivism and radicalism. And on the other hand, right, he says that if you're keeping it too privately to yourself, so then you're also kind of not opening yourself up to others, to being influenced and learning from others. So that both of these traditions, as we almost always conclude, certainly carry weight and have their place. But I think it's worthwhile to, as we prepare, all the Hasidic masters say that Shavuos is our yearly recommitment or re-experiencing of Kabbalah Torah, of receiving and accepting the Torah. So as we prepare again to accept and receive the Torah, to think about what exactly is Torah in our lives, how do we relate to it, and what does that mean for how we talk about and share or don't share Torah with others.
I think a simple answer, very simple, is Torah is what we teach our children.
Okay, for sure, Torah is what we teach our children.
That's
But
fundamental.
it might be more than that too. And I was just going to say, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. I lost it. Oh, I lost it. I'm sorry.
Torah is our way of life,
Yeah,
but it's not their way of life.
right. So yeah, part of it is how we can deal with these sort of multiple truths. Like that we have our truth, but we don't think everyone else is bound by that truth. Is a really complicated place to be. So I think it's worth reflecting on these sources and these ideas, and hopefully that will be enriching to your preparation for Shavuos. And I'm looking forward to sharing the Chag with everyone. Should be a nice yontif in shul. I'm going to say now that with yontif ending Monday night, I don't think we're going to have time to prepare a shiur for next Tuesday night.
That's okay.
So we might have to take a rain check on next week's Parsha class, but we'll keep the learning strong. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone over yontif.
Likewise.
All right.
Thank you.
Any final
Thank
questions
you.
or thoughts? No.
Yeah, I was just thinking from the from Pirkei number 5, there were a lot of quotes about what you should, how you should share, what you should share in terms of learning, which it sort of reminds me that this is one of the reasons you always have a category-sanagor situation.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. All right. Lila Tov, everybody.
Lila Tov, thank
Judy, feel
you.
good. Feel good, Judy.
Everybody
Rest
be
up.
well,
Thank you.
please.
Okay.
Yes.